focus today is we really wanted to talk about diversity in the legal industry in our firms. And when I say diversity, I'm thinking from the perspective more broadly, right? I'm thinking gender diversity, I'm thinking age diversity, I'm thinking cultural and racial diversity. And certainly in light of what our country has been dealing with in terms of racial tensions over the last few months, I think that it's a very important conversation for us to have. And I want us to talk about it from the perspective of, what has been our experience with diversity or lack of diversity, and in a way that we can better understand how do we set up our firms for success and not make the same mistakes of our fathers and mothers, right? Or those that have come before us. How can we create a different and better experience for lawyers and our staff, in our firms? And even being in a solo practice, I still think that there's an opportunity for us to have discussion on how do we support, diversity? How do we support other service providers and vendors and trying to, bring about some positive change in our industry? Because I started this podcast series basically that said, we need to do better. I mean, I think we can all agree we need to do better in our industry. And sometimes our firms are in places where there's not a lot of diversity in general. I think we talked about this with Livingston Barger in Bloomington. Sometimes we're in a situation geographically that's not very diverse. And getting talent in general is a challenge, but how do we create, a firm in which we embrace differences and different ways of thinking, and that comes from different backgrounds. So let's open up the conversation. But AJ being in Chicago, very diverse, St. Louis, very diverse. Let's open up the conversation with I'd like to hear from you guys. What have been some specific experiences that you have had in terms of diversity? And I'd love for this to be a gender conversation too, right? Because I think whether we like it or not, there's a difference, or has been a difference with females and males in our industry, right? And those in equity positions, partner positions, non-partner positions. So I'd like to hear what have been your experiences? And I think it's fair to be able to say, you know what? I haven't had many experiences because I've just been in a very non-diverse culture for a really long time, and I'm a white person working in a white firm, and there's been no diversity. That's okay if that's been your experience. How do we move forward from here, right? So what have been your experiences, good, bad, or ugly, so that we can create a conversation around change? That's the goal here today.
Well, Jamie, I'll jump in. I can tell you about my personal experience. I started my career working for one of the large law firms in St. Louis. When I was hired, I remember I was hired I was a summer associate. I was hired full time, and I was the only African American that started at the same time that I did. I was the only minority that started at that same time that I did. And although the firm brought on anywhere from 8 to 14 attorneys per year, it was 10 years before they hired another minority attorney. So there was literally probably 90 to 100 attorneys hired through the firm in the 10-year period between when I started and when the next minority attorney was hired. The firm had been around for 90 years, and when I made equity partner, I was the third African American, and only the fourth minority to make equity partner at the firm after 90 plus years, and this is in the early 2000s. So that to me, that was it's kind of a stark thing to get hired and then watch year after year after year of being the only I was the only minority associate almost my entire time being an associate at the firm. So it can certainly be an isolating feeling in that regard. The other thing I will say is this, and I know we want to talk about diversity and I agree we should talk about it from a very macro sense. But the other thing that I thought was very interesting is I spent, ironically, a large amount of my time at that firm being on the recruiting committee. And what I remember most about that is when we were recruiting, on the recruiting committee, there'd be lots of conversations about, well, we've got 4 law students from WashU and 2 from this school, but we want to branch out. We need to get somebody from the University of Illinois because we haven't had an attorney from the University of Illinois for the past 4 years, or we haven't had an attorney from Notre Dame for the past couple of years, or this attorney is at Stanford and we need to go reach out to get one from Stanford, Mm-hmm. I remember those conversations, and those conversations were about really wanting to have a diverse class of attorneys coming in from different law schools, right? Because they felt that was a value. And then we would have conversations even about attracting attorneys from different areas of the country, or or this attorney his father works for someplace, and I think there's a business reason for kind of giving this person extra credit. So we would talk about all of those things. But the minute the conversation switched to either race, primarily race, not so much gender, but if it switched to race, the first response was, well, we really want to make sure that we're hiring the right quality. We're not going to change our standards. And what I thought was really ironic was that conversation about the resistance about it and not wanting to change our standards didn't really come up in the context of let's get somebody from Mizzou versus somebody from SLU. It didn't come up in the context of, hey, this person is from the Chicago area. Maybe we should bring somebody from Chicago into the firm because it might be important. It didn't come up in those contexts. That sort of I'll call it predisposition that in order to achieve diversity you have to sacrifice quality only really came up when we talked about racial balancing. And so I think that as I look back over the past 20 plus years, from my perspective, at least, there's a lot of talk about wanting to improve diversity, but to me, there's a lack of intentionality and commitment and to the process. Right? I felt a lot of it was if diversity falls in our lap, that's great, but how much we actively want to go out and make concrete efforts to achieve it is up for debate. So I didn't mean to go on so long, but that's just my personal experience.
No, I think that's really important. I mean, there was a lot packed in there that I think is, even just sharing your experience, it's like helps other people hearing who haven't been through that experience. Yeah. Like if you've had those conversations, many times, a negative connotation connected to race isn't like felt or even thought about by the person who's making that statement, right? To say, well, we didn't talk about the threat to quality when we were talking about a geographic location of a lawyer or where they're coming from, but the second we start talking about race, we're assuming that we have to change, talk about quality. Like why are we now talking about quality, but we weren't talking about quality before? The people that are making those statements, that's one of those more nuanced, it's not overtly, what's the word that I'm looking for? Being negative, right, against a particular race, but it's happening because it's coming from somewhere else, right? It's being perpetuated from somewhere else. And one of my experiences was very overt in that I was sitting in a room with, partners, key decision makers, and they were discussing a gentleman that they were saying, well, he's not fast enough in his work. And so maybe he needs to get English lessons, like assuming he's not fast at his work because he doesn't know how to speak English. And that doesn't even connect, right? It's not even the same thing, right? Because he said he's working with data. He's working with numbers. He's not reading words. So him understanding the English language better is not going to make him necessarily faster in his data work with numbers. And so that first statement, while it seemed really asinine and silly to me, then the next thing that followed up was very negative. It was, well, he's by nature lazy because he's Indian. And it was so, that was one of those so overt like it sounds like a shocking statement. But it was said, right? And I'm sitting there like, is no one else bothered? Is no one else bothered by this? Because I'm very bothered, and I'm not only very bothered by the statement, but I also know he's not Indian. He's from Pakistan, right? Like, we're making this overgeneralization about a culture and about a person when that's not even where they're from, and we have to be better. I mean, that's where, and so that was it. I think to me, like, that very negative experience, and it wasn't even like to me personally, but being a part of it, making me feel incredibly uncomfortable. It impacted me, right? It impacted me in wanting to figure out I mean, certainly as a woman, I've had lots of experiences in gender differences within our industry. We could probably talk all day about those, but I wanted to just share that experience because I think that too, those things happen. And I want to better understand too strategies on when we're in the moment in those kinds of conversations, what are the things that we can say that will make a difference, right? Or like I mean, that's a tricky conversation. Yes, we want to try to fix things from like a deeper level, from an inside out, but also when we're in those tricky conversations, what's the best way that we can address that conversation, right, in a way that's going to be supportive and productive and, like with confidence and strength. I think that's a fair conversation for us to have too. So I wanted to share my experience, just to put it out there because it was very direct and it did happen. So anybody else want to share before we kind of talk about the next topic or next?
Yeah, I'll share. I think it's important when somebody makes a comment like that. I think you have to judge where you are and what your power position is in the room. And actually, I think you kind of have to do your age too, because I am knocking on the door of 60. Okay. So what I would say at age 59 and 11/12 is probably different than what I would have said at age 29.
That's fair.
Yeah. These days, as a 59 and 11/12 old person, I would say something. I mean, I think I would be very careful in choosing my words to say something like, I know you don't mean to stereotype, but I find when you make those like blanket statements, like everybody who's Indian is lazy, for example, that it's just not true. There are plenty of, exceptions to that rule. There are plenty of, is it even a rule? Gee, my experience has been, I've worked with a lot of Indians who are super hardworking. So I know you don't mean it like that, but gosh, it really comes across badly. You might not want to say that in the future. Or I don't know. I mean, I really, at this point in my life, I would take it on. But I think, you want to be gentle because if you just attack them, then they don't hear you.
Sure.
A couple of things. One is, I must confess, obviously, for myself, I don't find myself sitting in a room where there's a lot of overt statements made. I think generally people, because of my mere presence in the room, tend to be a little bit more on. There are things they might have thought or might have said had I not been there. They generally don't say it around me, so I don't really get that much of the overtness of it. But I do think. But even some of the experiences I've had, which are more subtle, I do think Kim makes a great point about you have to know time, place, audience, and everything else. Going back to the story I told you before, I can tell you that, being a third or fourth year associate, sitting in a room where the majority of people are partners in the room and you hear something that's more subtle, it's deciding how you take that on or what you say is challenging, and to Kim's point, as a fourth or fifth year associate, I probably did not feel comfortable, challenging somebody on that. Now, at this point in my career where I'm at now, I would feel very comfortable, saying, wait a minute, why, why are we not talking, why is this part of diversity important and this part isn't, kind of thing, and
Vincent,
having
I
that
hear,
conversation.
I noticed that you're not sharing your age.
I am in my 50s, just like you, Kim. So there we go. We are
For 1
co-50-year-olds.
week, I can continue to say I'm in my 50s.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you, but I had to do it. Okay, go on. I agree with you. Yes.
Yes, that is correct. Yeah. So, but no, I do think it makes a difference. Like you said, your age, where you are. I mean, and even toward the latter part of my career with my former firm, I started becoming a lot more outspoken about issues because I felt like, that I was on a more solid platform to do that. So I think that how you address that really has to be taken into that context. And I think therefore it's really hard to give any definitive answer to that question because it's all going to be very dependent upon the person, time, place, setting, and who the other people in the room. It's one thing if you're at a large firm, for example, and the statement's made by the managing partner of the firm versus it's made by a junior partner or a senior associate at the firm, right? You may feel more comfortable challenging one person but not the other person, so all that comes into play. So those are my 2 cents.
So did you, Vince, whenever you were on the hiring committee or the recruiting committee, did you ever in that setting say something about or questioning the connection of quality to race versus quality to school?
I don't know that I directly talked about that. I do remember, so I was on it for about 10 years and I actually, I was asked I actually stepped down from it because it became increasingly unhappy with how things were going. So part of my response was I no longer want to be a part of it. You know what I mean? And I guess probably not the right response, but at the time it felt like my way of protesting some things, you know what I mean?
Sure.
And so I just said, I just don't, I don't want to be a part of this process. So, but I do remember not really challenging that issue, but being a little more forceful on the idea of promoting diversity. You know what I mean? Because at first, I was probably a little hesitant to sort of take that platform. And I think that's one of the things too that I think can be challenging too, because whether I feel like sometimes, whether you're a female or an attorney of color or whatever, but I feel like a lot of times there's the expectation that you're also going to be the champion of diversity and you're also going to be the proponent of it, and that becomes a double-edged sword because I think in some sense there's the concept, you worry about the concept of, well, is this a self-serving kind of advocacy, right? So if I'm an attorney of color and I'm advocating for attorneys of color and greater opportunities, am I doing that for my own selfish purposes, or am I really, and the same thing if you're a woman, if you're advocating for greater females and greater leadership positions within the firm or something like that, and you happen to be a female attorney, is this sort of a self, advocating kind of thing? When really, I think my experience has been for the women and attorneys of color who have been in those positions, it's not about advocating for themselves, it's about advocating, but there's that, I think a little bit of that, how does this going to come across kind of feeling about that because of that situation. And I really think that from my experience, when I've seen significant gains or significant traction on diversity issues, it's really been championed by someone primarily who is not an attorney of color or who is not a woman, because I think they are able to come to it, especially with a perspective that doesn't carry some of that baggage with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. The thing that really hasn't come up yet, and maybe Joe, you could even speak to this a little bit too, is the age diversity. And what do our firms look like? Because I think Livingston Burger has been making a concerted effort over the last few years. I don't think it's uncommon where firms that have been around for a while end up in this. I'm just going to say it, guys. I think at this point, you all know me well enough to know I'm a pretty straight shooter, but there's just a bunch of old white guys running a firm, right? There's a bunch of old white guys running this firm. And where do we go from here? right? Like, we're not going to have a firm if it's just a bunch of old white guys running a firm, because at some point they're not going to be running the firm anymore. And who's there, right? Who's around? So I was thinking, Joe, maybe you could just jump in and talk about Livingston Barger's journey a little bit, and where you think you're doing well and what more you guys think you have to do.
Sure, absolutely. So for those that don't know on the call, our firm is centrally located in Illinois, Bloomington and Champaign, Illinois. So University of Vince mentioned University of Illinois. That's where I'm located right now. Our firm has been around for roughly about the same time, 90 plus years. And Jamie's right. It is literally a bunch of older white men, with one exception. There is I'm going to say middle-aged female that is an equity partner at our firm. And when I joined the firm a number of years ago, I noticed that from an outsider coming in, the firm was what I would call top heavy in age, and also point blank white. And I feel, so my personal background is I was raised, my two sisters are adopted from Korea. So I was raised in an environment where my parents went out of their way to incorporate other cultures into our life. And so I got that exposure at a very young age, exposure from my grandparents and my family to very diverse cultures, because their belief was something very simple. Other people view the world differently than you, and part of your obligation as a human being is to look outside yourself and see how other people view the world, and to be able to respect and appreciate that. So that's how I grew up, and taking that into the practice of law, you notice that it is largely a lot of males and a lot of white males in the legal profession. So when I started at Livingston Barger, and what I've noticed in the last few years is there has been a change in that mindset. That mindset being, we're going to try to recruit younger people. We're going to try to build the future of the firm for a longer period of time. As part of that, unfortunately, we don't yet have a diversity committee. I would hope that that is something that would be coming in the near future at our firm, but I don't know where that currently stands. And I think part of that is because I'm on the outside a little bit. I'm a non-equity partner at this point in time, so I'm not involved in some of those decisions. I say that relative to our firm, but I also believe as a professional, it is our obligation to bring up people that have different backgrounds, have different life experiences into your firm, because and I personally value that, because you can take the same set of facts, and this is part of our job in litigation, and on my end of things, you can take the same set of facts and you can see it from a bunch of different perspectives, and everybody's own unique perspective and life journeys frame the lens through which they see it. And then I think that helps solve a client's problem, and helps also communicate ideas to judges or the decision makers in any given situation. So I hope that, sorry to go on for so long, but I hope that kind of explains a little bit of background.
No, I think it's good. I would be curious to know, how, I think it's a good break in the conversation to shift to, what can we do, right? What are things, I really appreciate, if you guys haven't listened to it yet, we did 2 podcasts on this topic. We've got more that are coming out, but I really appreciated the input of my guests on some real practical things that we can do to help, perpetuate diversity in our industry from a positive perspective. I'd love to shift our conversation in that direction and start talking about what can we do about it, right? What can we actively do about it within our own firms, within the industry as a whole? Would love for you guys to share. I mean, certainly, go ahead, Kim.
Jamie, I spent a dozen years in-house at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and we had some really awesome preference programs. And I'm not going to use the affirmative action word because they weren't really affirmative action. They were preference programs. And one of the and they had such great results. I mean, like, because SIU runs, for example, a dental school, a nurse practitioner program, a nurse anesthetist program. I mean, these are programs that people, when you graduate School of Pharmacy, where you graduate, you get a job and you can make a lot of money. Trust me, when I heard what those pharmacy kids were earning right out of school, I'm like, what the hell? Why didn't I become a pharmacist? Anyway, one
There's
of the
still
things,
time. There's still time,
there's
kids.
still time. That's right. I could collect Social Security and become a pharmacist at the same time.
Well, Kim, when you apply for admission, you will add to their diversity because
Yes,
you know,
I will. There you go.
go.
But one of the things, so I became really involved in these programs and making sure that they were acceptable under the Supreme Court rulings and everything. And one of the things that is really important is to have that kind of minimum number. If you're going to do a diversity program and make it work, I mean, Vincent, you're the outlier because most of the time bringing in one person of color or one woman, and Joe, this is true for your firm too, typically that doesn't work because that person is so isolated that there's just a much higher rate of, I got to get out of here and be with some people who look like me or some people who get my sense of humor or whatever. And that if you can get that minimum number of people together, you have a much greater chance of success. So instead of hiring one African-American associate, you need to hire a couple and really be thoughtful about it. Same thing with bringing women in. I'm sure the other lawyers on the call the other female lawyers in the call have been the only woman in the room many times. That's certainly been my experience. And I don't know. Sometimes it can be uncomfortable. I always thought that was an interesting point, though. A small number makes a big difference.
Kim, if I can jump in, I think it makes a difference from a variety of levels. So, I've seen this, and like I said, my first 18 years was at a large firm, but I watched this. And, obviously, if you think about how larger firms operate, they bring in a number of associates every year, 10, 12, whatever. Within 5 or 6 years, a third to half of them aren't there anymore. And they have for a variety of reasons. Some did not work out. Some left voluntarily. They just leave, right?
Right.
But this is where the numbers come into play. So if for example, if I have a class that comes in and there happen to be 8 white males in that class, and if 6 years down the road, 4 of them are still there, well, there's not necessarily any negative connotation that hiring white males didn't work out because 4 of them are still there. Now, flip that around. If you hire one minority attorney and that minority attorney isn't there 4 years down the road, well, then we hired one, it didn't work out. You can run into that problem, right? Same thing if we hired 2 females and the 2 females are gone, right? So if you only hire 1 or 2 of a particular demographic, then not only is there what Kim talked about, that sort of natural, I'm by myself, I'm isolated kind of feeling, which can contribute to them leaving. But when they do leave, for whatever the reason is, whether it's because they didn't work out or because they chose to leave, it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that it didn't work out. See, we hired this person and it didn't work out because they're not here anymore. And that is sometimes, to me, a victim of starting with a small sample size to begin with.
That's a good point. One of the ideas that was brought up on my podcast, I was interviewing Toya Gavin, and one thing that she said that I thought was a really good idea, will it ever happen? Who knows? But making salaries public, or public at least within your firm. So, right? Like, that's a really good accountability measure in terms of equal pay, right? Equal pay across genders, across age, across, different races. I mean, that's and having pay structures. So the pay structure and the system itself being public, right? And clear. So it's not so subjective. I mean, that's step one, right? Step one is, do you have a pay structure in which people can clearly see? In universities, it's this way, right? In universities, you are a D1 employee. D1 employees have a salary range between this and this, right? And there's flexibility a little bit within that range. It's not a huge range, but it might be between $55,000 and $75,000 a year, right? Like that's the range. So if you're in a classification of a D1 role, you're going to be making between, and it's maybe not that big of a range, but you're going to be making between $55,000 and $75,000. That's what your salary range is going to be. There are nuances within that. I mean, people provide that range because of years of experience, right? So if you've got 10 years of experience, you might be on the higher end. If you've got 2 years, you might be on the lower end, right? So I think that's step one. Do we even have a compensation structure, number one? Do we even have a structure, or are we reinventing the wheel every single time? I think that was one of the biggest things I brought to the big firm that I worked for, is the way that we do job offers, right? We shouldn't be giving job offers and salaries based on what people were making and what they want to make. It should be based on market. Are we paying people at market? Because you end up perpetuating a problem, depending on your market, where you're now underpaying people what you should be paying them, and then they're more likely to leave because they're going to get a higher offer somewhere else. And then you end up with issues with, paying people differently without realizing it, from a gender, from a diversity perspective. So I think having a structure, period. So like, this is our structure, and I mean, there are cons to that, because if you want to really get top talent, and they're paid outside of that structure, I mean, it's not without flexibility, of course, but you got to try to incentivize people in a different way. Structure, period, is good. Then are you publicizing that structure? Then publicizing pay and what people are making? That's pretty radical. I don't know anyone that does that in the legal industry. Do you guys?
I don't. I'm our firm's managing partner, and when you said that, I cringed a little bit.
I know, right?
thinking, oh my God, I'm going to spend my. I'm going to have my.
Love it. But you guys, have you ever looked at the facts of the Lily Ledbetter case? I mean, that is what happened to her. She was being paid way less than the guys in her same role by Goodyear, I think.
Yeah.
And somebody in the HR department was so appalled by the disparity that they sent her an anonymous letter with like a printout of payroll and said, do you realize what you're being paid, compared to the guys? Somebody anonymously sent her that. So pretty interesting. And then of course, she sued and lost in the Supreme Court. Then the Congress came back and passed the Lily Ledbetter Act. And I don't know, that's an interesting idea.
Well, what? Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say something. And I guess in following up what Kim said, so I'm an employment lawyer by practice, so that's what I spend my time doing. But there's started in California, but there's a growing trend among courts to basically say that you can't ask for someone's past salary or compensation. Right. And the reason for that, Kim, is exactly what you're saying, what Jamie said, is that what that does is any inequities that are already there, all that does is perpetuate those inequities over and over and over again. So there's a growing, and I think that's it hasn't quite become uniform across the country, but certainly that is where the law is leaning towards, is the idea that when you are hiring somebody, you don't ask what they made at their previous job. You can ask them what they want to make, or you can ask them or tell them what their salary range is, but you can't ask what their previous compensation was, because then you're sort of perpetuating those inequities. And I think, so I guess, Jamie, sorry about that. It's not quite making salaries public, but certainly not asking that question. And to your point, I think Jamie and Kim, focusing on what job are we hiring for, and what do we want to pay for this job, and focusing on that, not necessarily what somebody was making in their prior job, it would be a way to sort of try to eliminate some of those inequities.
Go ahead, Mike. Yeah.
You say it's amazing how many parallels between this and the nonprofit world there are. I do a lot of work in nonprofits, and it's the same sort of situation. A lot of nonprofits are run by white people. And actually, there was a great article from Helen Kim Ho, who's an attorney herself, but does a lot of nonprofit, about 3 years ago, 8 ways people of color are tokenized in nonprofits. And Vince, when you mentioned you were put on the recruiting committee, it's funny because that's one of those ways, right? Like you only bring up people of color or women when you want to show diversity or when you need that picture for the website. So going back to kind of like what we can do is like realize we're engaging in those activities. And with respect to salaries, I forget who did it, but there was just a survey that came out from 2000 to 2018 among major law firms. Women partner salaries went up 22% in those 18 years, and male partner salaries went up 42%. So to tie it back to nonprofits, there's a shift in nonprofits that when you post a job posting, you just post the salary. You post a salary range and that's it. So the transparency is there, and people who want to apply can. And I mean, you know what your budget is. So starting with that transparency and kind of alluding to what Vince said, not relying on what they made previously or anything like that. Just here's what the salary is.
So Charlotte started a chat here that she's been trying to hire a lawyer of color for a while. Charlotte, what challenges have you had there? I mean, I think that's why I even stated originally too. I think that there are some very real challenges in geographically lack of diversity and talent that's wanting to leave but not stay in their communities. You know, I grew up in a very small, primarily white town. So, you know, recruiting can be a challenge when you're trying to perpetuate diversity, that's for sure. So, Charlotte, if you want to type in or say what your challenges are doing.
Hey, Jamie, thanks. I can't go video, but I'm audio today. I've been trying to hire a person of color, an attorney of color, and a attorney that speaks fluent Spanish for almost 10 years. I live outside of Nashville, Tennessee. I have a boutique firm there. And our community is comprised of a substantial African-American population and Hispanic population. We would like to serve those communities. But I go to the recruiting fairs, the table talks with Vanderbilt, Belmont, Memphis, whatever, and I can't hire somebody. I've tried. Then they take positions in other firms. I'm not sure it's economic in terms of like, maybe I'm just not paying, but I have a great opportunity. And I'm just wondering from this group, you know, what techniques do you think would be helpful? And, you know, I guess my point, Jamie, is you can want to diversify your firm in a number of ways and it not happen. I hired an intern who spoke fluent Spanish and offered her position, and she went back to her family in California. How can you stop that? I had a man that I hired. He never passed the bar exam. So I don't know. I'm searching. I guess I want to just put that angle on the box to, okay, yes, I want to hire someone. I want to pay him market rate for my area. And how do I get somebody?
Charlotte, you know, here's what, and I don't know the Nashville area, I guess, and you may have already done some of these things. But one of the things I would say is, you know, certainly reaching out to, for example, if I know Vanderbilt's there and there's some of the Belmonts and the other law schools. They probably have a Black Law Students Association or a Hispanic Law Students Association, maybe trying to reach out and make contacts with them, because you're going to get the best candidates by either having a larger pool to look at, or by getting referrals from people at those institutions. So perhaps reaching out to the Career Services Office or the minority the Black Law Students or Hispanic bar associations there might help. The other thing is maybe look at law schools outside of your area. Because again, sometimes you have to, and that's the thing. And I'm just saying this. Charlotte, you're correct, because even when I was on the recruiting committee at my firm, I mean, there were some of those same issues. Even in St. Louis, trying to get more minority attorneys applying and coming through. And so sometimes I was a big advocate of just casting a wider net. And so maybe it's going out to law schools that are outside of your metropolitan area, because, quite frankly, a lot of law students come out of law schools and they all don't stay in the same geographic area where their law school is. Some of them are willing to relocate and move, and maybe going outside of the area increases the talent pool and the possibilities. You might also want to look at some of the historically Black law schools that have law schools associated with them, because again, that's part of it is just finding a deeper talent pool, and that sometimes requires casting a deeper net, or as I said earlier, trying to make connections inside those law schools with either people in career services or faculty members who are the sponsors for some of the different bar associations within the law schools. So those are just some suggestions, but I sympathize with you because I know it can be difficult.
I don't know that I have a good answer to it, other than I can tell you that, like Joe, we're in Central Illinois, and, I've been involved in our recruiting for a couple of decades, probably at least. And, we have a good reputation. We're a decent sized firm for the area. We do all sorts of different work, and we have had continuing issues. We're 10 attorneys right now. We've had issues really that whole time. Sometimes getting candidates at all, and then other times getting candidates, but not very quality candidates. I know the deans at most of the law schools, the placement deans and career services people, and generally speaking, what we get. The short version is people don't want to move here. Occasionally, you find somebody that does, or somebody wants to move back. I've come to the conclusion that it's primarily, it's not all economic. Some of them obviously have a student loan issue, but it's an education issue at the law school level, and it's a pretty complex issue. Maybe we'll see a little difference in terms of where we're going down the road in terms of getting people with some remote work and things like that. But I sympathize with you. I don't have a good answer. And generally speaking, Nashville's supposed to be a very good place to live. It's certainly a good place to visit. Honestly, that surprises me now. Of course, I think it's a good place to live now. Maybe I wouldn't have years ago, but I find that very interesting, and at least I can take a little solace from it that if we can't recruit here in Central Illinois, it's you can't do it in Nashville either. So not very helpful, but those are my observations.
Charlotte, I worked in Springfield, Illinois for a couple of years, and we hired an attorney of color. She was a mom who had left the practice of law. Her kids were a little bit older than, and she wanted to return to work part-time. And she was terrific. I think there's a pool of candidates out there. My suggestion might be to forget the law school route and look at people who either want to do part-time, who are looking for a more flexible schedule. Maybe their spouse has moved to Nashville and now they're dragged along, and they're not sure what they're going to do. But be open, because there are some very good middle-aged to older, who am I talking about, lawyers out there.
I think that's a great idea, Kim, and probably better than the one I was going to suggest, and that's just the remote stuff that Randy touched on. Is that we're in an unusual situation here where meeting with clients remotely and all is not unusual, and I know it's several small firms, very small firms that have remote associates, and have even did that before the before the pandemic, because they wanted to retain associates that wanted to go out of the St. Louis area. And I apologize for being late. I had a call that I meant to send to voicemail, and I screwed up and answered it. So.
We'll only dock you 2 points. Any other practical thoughts or ideas on how we can approach diversity? I mean, I really appreciate the advice, you all were giving me earlier, but understanding everyone's in a different position, right? If you're an associate attorney and you're witnessing something very overtly negative or racially slurring, it's a much more difficult position to be in to try to speak up about it. I do think, though, in light of what's been going on in our society, confidence more, especially for our fellow friends and friends of color that don't feel like they can speak up for themselves, or gender too. I mean, I consistently found myself, in an HR role trying to push and support equal pay amongst genders. I mean, it's pretty bad in our industry. I mean, the ABA does a study every year putting out, we actually have more women in the industry, but no fault of you guys. Most men think that there are more men in the industry, but there's not. There's actually more women. There's just less women in leadership, less women in roles. I think the ABA, I have the ABA report from 19. I'm not remembering the exact, but there's just barely more women in the industry than men, like 51% to 49% or something like that. But there's only 12% of equity partners are women. If that's not shocking, I don't know what is. But I think that we do have responsibility within our circle of influence, right, or our position of power, to try to improve those standards. So I do think now more than ever in history, there is more tolerance is probably the wrong word, but it's the word that keeps coming up in my head. Tolerance for pushing the envelope on behaviors, that are not good, right? Like, I think there's more openness, especially given everything going on in our world, for people speaking up against racial inequity, gender pay inequity, and there's more sensitivities to it as companies are being held accountable for those poor decisions too. So I do think, practically speaking, we can be more confident and bold in our words and what we're saying when we bump into those situations. And I think even one thing that I've started doing that's real practical is, if I say something, I'm more sensitive to my own language. So if I say something that's maybe, actually, I said something recently amongst this group. Anyone who's following me on social media probably saw this post I put out there. I hung out with a bunch of 20-somethings, which was like a really fascinating experience, being 38 myself. Over the weekend, my brother's 25. I was hanging out with his friends, which are slightly younger than him. And actually, I made a comment that was very, what's the word I'm looking for? Gender, it was like perpetuating, right? Like the male stereotype and female stereotype, but actually against women, right? Which is not my normal MO. And it was like this 22-year-old guy was like, well, that was very that was kind of closed-minded. And I was like, oh my God, it was. You're right. You're totally right. Why do I even say that, right? Where'd that even come from? Because it's a part of our vernacular, right? And when you've grown up, I think, in a privileged race and a privileged community and privileged, socioeconomic status, and you learn this lingo and you have to unlearn yourself. So I was going to just offer, I think, another practical thing is that when we hear ourselves maybe perpetuating something that's not so great in terms of racial diversity or even age, making generational assumptions. Oh, they're just lazy because they're a millennial. right? Like even making comments like that, I think are highly inappropriate. Just like we would never want to say, oh, well, there's no place for them. They're just too old. They can't handle technology, right? I'm giving two different like broad spectrums of I think we can make assumptions and generalizations about generations that are inappropriate and make people feel uncomfortable and isn't honoring and respectful. So my offer to the group is for us to be acknowledging when we've maybe even said something that's perpetuating something negative, say, you know what, I shouldn't have said that way. Like that was wrong. I don't even know where that came from. I'm sorry. Like owning that, I think is really important to that conversation too.
Hey, Jamie.
Yeah.
I was going to quickly tell everybody about the Harvard project on implicit bias. I'll chat out the website to do it. It doesn't take long, and here you go on their website. A ton of people have done this, and they're collecting the data, and you might find it really interesting. I've done it a couple different ways. You can do it for gender, you can do it for race, you can do it for ethnicity. And it will give you some information back about yourself. And it might be an interesting thing. I don't know. Interesting way to look at what your own biases are.
Yeah,
Kim, I'm glad you said that. I've taken the test as well. And, I know we're getting close to the end of our hour. I guess the one thing I would want to kind of say is from my perspective, and you mentioned implicit bias, which is something that, everybody has their biases, and I think we all have to acknowledge that. But to me, I think one of the things we can do is to become a lot more intentional about the decisions we're making, right? Especially if you are in a position of power or authority, or whether you're the position, whether you're to direct work at your firm or make a hiring decision or whatever, but really become very intentional about understanding when you're making a decision, why you're making that decision and what's driving that decision. Because I think what ends up happening is, everybody's busy, everybody's rushed. And if we don't slow down and become very intentional in our decision, we default to sort of our autopilot mechanisms. And our autopilot mechanisms is where our biases can really grab hold, And so,
right.
one of the things I tell people all the time is, we have this tendency, if you start with the idea that you are successful in what you do, then when you start looking at trying to find somebody who's successful, you automatically start filtering somebody who looks like you, talks like you, is like you, because you feel that's the definition of success, right? I'm successful. I've done it. I want somebody else to do it. So you start looking for the same characteristics, your characteristics is that other person. And understanding that there are multiple ways to get to success, and maybe, how you got there or your characteristics that led to your success aren't the only way. So when you start looking at, hey, I'm looking for somebody who has these characteristics, maybe thinking, are those really the characteristics that are absolutely necessary? Or are there other characteristics, or why do I believe that these are the only characteristics that are important? Or why do I place more emphasis on these things? So I just think coming with things with that greater level of intentionality and really focusing on why you're making a decision can sometimes help. So that's why.
Vince, thank you so much for sharing that and for being on our call today. I think that's a great word for us to wrap up on, and that's intention. And I wanted to do just a fast shout out to Vince's firm, actually, Mickaso Tool. Joe, you know what? I think a separate conversation with like maybe you and Pete and Vince might be great, because I think like Livingston Burger is trying to do what Mickaso Tool's been able to do, right? So Mickaso Tool, old firms, been around a long time, run by old white men, right? And where Mickaso Tool has come in like the last 3 years, they've come so far. I think we're at 25 lawyers. Is that right, Vince? I think
about 21. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, in where they've come in terms of diversity in gender and in, racial diversity, and they're actually minority owned now at this point. Is that right, Vince? Am I saying that the right way? I think that they've done a lot of great work, and it's through that word intention. Being intentional. And obviously, Vince, you get a lot of credit for that, but also that the legacy of Mickaso Tool was really open to those conversations too, right? And seeing a different future than where they were today. So shout out to what you guys have done there at Make Us O'Toole. And I'll connect you guys offline too, because I think that would be a really great conversation. Because Livingston Park was kind of where probably you were, Vince, like 3 to 5 years ago.
That'd be fantastic. Thank you.
I'd be happy to talk. Thanks.
So we're at 11:01. I want to share this with you all. I might have mentioned this in our last call. I like to wrap up with something fun and funny. And I just got on and off the plane to Utah. And I thought this was really clever. It's like when you're getting ready to get on a plane for 3 hours and you have to wear a mask for 3 straight hours. It's the exact time in history when you need to not take away the booze, right? Yeah. But flying today, they serve you water and a little bag of pretzels, and that's it, right? Like there's no drink service on the plane due to COVID, which totally makes sense. But yeah, you definitely it's challenging to not be able to maybe have a Bloody Mary on the plane while you're wearing a mask for 3 hours. So I thought this was really cute. It's my emotional support bar cart. Of course I should be able to bring it on with me. It's got a leash and everything. I thought that was clever. So
I like it.
I'll leave that little chuckle with you all, and I hope that you have a fabulous rest of your week. Thank you for engaging in this conversation, because I think it's through conversation that we can perpetuate more positive change in our industry. So I appreciate you all so much. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyway.